Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. How do you define the heart of this city? The people, places, and rituals that give it its distinct character. Constance Rosenblum's latest book, More New York Stories, the best of the city section of the New York Times, can't contain all of the 8 million plus stories that exist in the naked city, but you'll find at least one urban love story that should compel any out-of-towner to pack their bags and get here quickly. The book has just been published by New York University Press. Connie edited that section, which appeared each Sunday, and she was its heart. She continues to find the most interesting stories and people, mainly for the real estate section, as she introduces us to New Yorkers who have the most interesting homes with great backstories. Welcome.
Thank you.
You were not born or raised in New York City. Do you feel you were destined to be here?
Well, I feel I was very lucky to be here. I grew up in upstate New York, and I came to New York after college, and with very few exceptions, I've never left. And I always wanted to live in the city. I always loved New York, and I feel I was very fortunate to end up where I wanted to be.
What was your first job in the city, and what was your first newspaper job in the city?
My first job in the city, I don't tell everybody this, but I worked doing PR for Lever Brothers Soap Company. And they paid for my tuition at NYU Graduate School, and I was very lucky. And then I went to Columbia Journalism School and worked for lots of little local newspapers, not all of which were around. And then I worked, which turned out to be a great job, for the New York City Planning Commission in the late 60s and early 70s, helping write the city's first master plan that took me to literally every neighborhood in New York City and taught me an enormous amount about New York and architecture and urban design. And from there, I was very lucky to end up at the Bergen Record in New Jersey,
Right.
but still live in New York.
Okay. So New York used to be a city where a lot of people came to pursue careers as writers, as journalists. But with newspapers sort of on their way out, and with the city being so expensive, is it still the place where young journalists come to try to make a career?
I think they do. It's interesting. I'm working right now on a story about how people in their 20s live in New York, and many of them are in journalistic-ish situations. They work for the Huffington Post. They work for small online magazines, and they really struggle in terms of housing in a way that I don't remember me and my friends struggling back in the day. But what I found fascinating about reporting this story is they make a lot of sacrifices, even the ones with pretty good salaries in terms of little apartments, remote neighborhoods, but they're thrilled to be here. They're happy to be here. They're not unhappy, and they're willing to pay the price because New York is still the center in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Now, you edited the city section for 10 years.
Yes.
Until it was killed.
Closed.
In 2009.
Sadly.
You have described it as one of the most interesting jobs in journalism. Why?
Well, I loved it. I continually thank my editors for having put me there. It was perfect for someone like me who was so interested in New York and in the outlying parts of New York. I loved stories about Staten Island and Queens and the Bronx. I wrote a whole book about the Bronx. And I loved stories about, so-called ordinary people, not necessarily the movers and shakers, but stories that really gave you a sense of how life is lived on ground level in the city. And the city section, because it didn't have to do certain other things. It didn't have to cover the mayoral election. It didn't have to worry about Iraq. It could do things that were kind of left over from other parts of the paper, but to me were totally fascinating.
And did you see that as its mission to cast a light on people that readers might otherwise not meet or know about, and sections of the city that they might not otherwise know about?
Very much so. One story that touched me very much, and I still get feedback about it, and was actually done by a young man at the Times who's been doing a lot of multimedia in the Middle East, and we all worry about him, is about someone we called the Chicken and Rice Man, and it was about a young man from Latin America who had made it his mission to feed homeless, hungry day workers who congregated in the streets in Queens. And he used to prepare these large vats of chicken and lasagna. We called him the Chicken and Rice Man. And he had come out in his van at night with his large pots and the labels, and he would feed these, every night, hundreds and hundreds of homeless, hungry men. And the story was written about him. It got a huge response. For him, large amounts of money poured in. The full foundation was set up. So now he can feed many more people. But he's someone who might not have gotten written about if you're just looking for the big visible stories.
Is he still around?
Yes,
Wow.
yes. And his reach has been hugely extended. I got an email from Adam Ellick, the person who wrote the wonderful story and did the video, saying that he's feeding double or triple the number of people.
Wow.
Very moving story.
How did you find your writers?
Well, I feel I was very lucky. I was lucky in having some extremely talented Times staffers write for me, like Manny Fernandez, who did a wonderful piece on the music of Morrisania, part of the Bronx, where soul and hip hop and doo-wop, so much music grew out of it. Michael Powell, who did a wonderful story on I think we called it the two Roberts, Caro and Moses. And Joe Berger used to write wonderful neighborhood stories. But, excuse me, we also had a lot of young journalists who had not yet made their name or made their mark. Some were recent Columbia Journalism School graduates. And I'd read every proposal that came in. I'd read the resumes. And there's a lot of talent out there. And sadly, as the economy for journalists became harder, we sort of get better and better people. And we get big name people because we could let them write interesting things for pennies, like, a Philip Lopate or a Vivian Gornick or Laura Cunningham, people who really almost were more famous than we deserve. But we could let them write their passions and write about New York, which there's not that much opportunity to do.
And with these famous people, would you just say, did they come to you, or did you go to them and say, I wish you'd write something for us? How did that work?
It was all sorts of things. I mean, one story I remember, this was in the previous collection of New York stories, when the last AIA Guide to New York came out 10 years ago. It's such an iconic book, and I wanted Philip Lopate, who I knew and who's an eloquent writer about architectural matters, to write about the book. And whatever he wrote, I knew was going to be great, and it was. And so we asked him, and thankfully he said yes, and he wrote a brilliant piece. And sometimes I just talked to people, and ideas would bubble up from the conversation. Vivian Gornick, again, the last book. She'd grown up in the Bronx. The Bronx had changed so much since her day, and I asked if she would go back to her old neighborhood near the zoo and just tell us what it was like to be Vivian going back. And it was such a moving and revealing piece. I mean, people were always better than you expected, and you expected they'd be great. So it was
How many
great.
pitches would you get a day or week?
Well, it got more as the economy for journalists got worse. It's hard to tell. I always felt like I was late in answering them, so I guess it was a lot. But you get things from left field and worlds you didn't know about. People would tell you about them and offer stories. And I was just amazed at how much talent there was out there. I always said the section could have been twice as large as it was every week and same quality. And in terms of this book, which has 50 essays up from 40 in the last one, without blinking an eye, I could have made it twice the size and it would have been the same quality. And the hardest part of doing the book was not putting things in, but cutting them out.
How much did you pay for those stories for the city?
Well, we didn't actually have people pay us. I was afraid we would get to that point. We paid so little, I am ashamed to say, but and I won't. But I think people were doing it not for the money, because it was never going to be about the money. But I think the section was well read. It was well read online. People liked it. And a lot of it, I think, was that people got to say things they wanted to say.
Right.
And that was hopefully worth more than the money, which we weren't paying them much of.
What kinds of stories did you like, and what kinds did you not like?
I loved personal essays. We established a feature called New York Observed, which was basically the personal essay about New York. It's like everyone has an interesting story in them about, the one-room apartment, or the closing of the beloved deli down the street, or there's one great essay in this book about by a woman who had been an usher at the Promenade Theater on Broadway in the 70s, which became a Sephora, and she was devastated, odd things that you wouldn't think people would care about. A woman wrote a beautiful essay, Joanna Baldwin, about a man she used to hear whistling in the winter streets of the village. I mean, it's a tiny thing, but it was eloquent. Never met him, but only heard him. And it became a metaphor of hope in New York. It was really, really profound.
Is there a distinctive character to each of the 5 boroughs, and if so, what is it for each one in your view?
I think that it might have been easier to say there was maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, when the boroughs maybe fit the stereotypes a little bit. Like Staten Island, you could say it's Republicans and it's green and it's spread out. But now, for example, there's a huge Mexican community, which wasn't there 30 years ago. Queens has an ethnic diversity that is they say every country in the globe is represented in Queens, and that's probably true. Brooklyn, you have a lot of old Brooklyn, you have a lot of new Brooklyn. The Bronx is very varied. It's certainly not the South Bronx of memory. So I think it's harder to make generalizations about the boroughs than it was.
Right. We'll be back with more with Constance Rosenblum, editor of More New York Stories, the best of the city section of the New York Times.
I was born on an island where swimming was a way of life. I never thought that anything could keep me from the water. Then I got throat cancer from smoking cigarettes and lost my voice. Now I have to cling to a hole in my throat. This water gets inside it. It will drown me. I used to love swimming.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with New York Times journalist Constance Rosenblum, editor of More New York Stories, the best of the city section of the New York Times. Brooklyn seems to be a borough that a lot of people want to write about. What is it about Brooklyn?
Well, I think that it feels to me as if every journalist in New York is living in Brooklyn. And when I was working on the section, I liked it when journalists lived in different places, because I thought they could write about where they lived. And then everyone was living in Brooklyn. And I thought I was doing something wrong. I wasn't getting the right journalists. But then I realized the journalists
They're just all
were in
living
Brooklyn.
there.
So we tried to get on top of the story by doing, a few years ago, a special issue on Brooklyn. We figured would make lemonade out of lemons, I guess. Or they weren't lemons, they were all great, but there were just a lot of them. And so we did, and what we tried to tease out is, what did Brooklyn mean and represent in the 21st century? And it wasn't just the hipsters in Williamsburg, there was a lot of old Brooklyn left, but we tried to figure out and express journalistically why Brooklyn had become the new Manhattan, as people said. And we had a wonderful essay by the writer Sukitu Mehta, who does live in Park Slope. And he talked about things like the low-rise nature of the borough and the characteristics of individual neighborhoods. And we had other pieces about other parts of Brooklyn that were less familiar. But I think that the popularity of Brooklyn is just an extension of the city's development, which has always spread further and further up, down, in, out. And Brooklyn was maybe the next obvious thing, especially as it became so expensive to live in Manhattan.
Right. What are some of the more interesting neighborhoods around right now, in your view?
Well, I'm, of course, very partial to the Grand Concourse, having written a book about it, Boulevard of Dreams. And what I find interesting about the Grand Concourse in the West Bronx is how much, in many ways, it has bounced back from its earlier incarnation as the South Bronx. People are living in these beautiful Art Deco buildings. They can afford it. They're near Manhattan and making a life for themselves in the Bronx. I think it's interesting the way remote parts of Manhattan are being colonized. Washington Heights, certainly, parts of the city where you just 10 years ago didn't have residential neighborhoods in Midtown and
Red
downtown.
Hook is hot.
Has Fairway and IKEA. It's like hugely hot, and you can go further and further into Brooklyn and areas that were once just sort of the amorphous South Brooklyn, back in Pete Hamill's day. They all have names, they all have adorable cafes, and they all have bars. I've been stunned by the development of Bushwick, which in the days when you and I were at the Daily News was the devastated neighborhood of New York, the metaphor of what happened in the '77 blackout. But I've interviewed young people living there in old mansions, and there's music, and there's art, and there's theater, and there are like entire lives that you can live without living in Bushwick, without leaving Bushwick. It's a remarkable transformation. Some of it's happening in Bed-Stuy, a little more slowly. But the neighborhoods have incredible resiliency in New York. It's like they never die. They just are reborn in an interesting way.
Is there anybody writing the kinds of stories and publishing the kinds of stories that used to be published in the city section? I mean, either at the Times or someplace.
Well, I think there are certainly columnists at the Times who write wonderful pieces capturing the texture of the city, which is great. I'm a fan of Mr. Beller's Neighborhood, which is a website that has stories about New York linked to their neighborhoods, physically linked on the web. And to me, there's some of that texture. Certainly, some of the
And
New
those are
Yorker.
written by, young people, sometimes students
not
and interns,
names
right?
of people, but they're very well written. They're very specific. They're very, very lapidary, and they're great. And they really give you a sense of New York.
You've taught are you still teaching at the Columbia Graduate School of
No, but
Journalism?
I've taught lots of places.
I'm teaching journalism, undergraduate journalism schools at Queens College. What do you think these students are going to wind up doing? I mean, the ones who are interested in pursuing a journalism career.
I think they're going to end up doing something that is definitely not like what you and I did back in the day, and not even what people doing 10 years ago are doing. But they're doing things on the web, they're doing things with audio. They're still being journalists. They're just being journalists in a very different medium. They're going to have to be technically skilled, or they will get nowhere. But they're growing up with this stuff in their genes. They don't need to learn it the way other people needed to learn it. And I think there's still the desire to tell these stories. They're just being told in smaller venues in different ways. But I think young people in New York have a passionate attachment to the city. That is why they're here. They're making an effort to be here. And they want to tell their stories. They want to tell other people's stories. And they're finding the ways to do it.
Has rereading the articles, to put together this second collection of city section stories, given you a sense of how the city has changed?
I think it has, but I think what it mostly does is remind me how rich it is, and remind me how powerful some of these stories are. And some of the stories are powerful whether or not the cities have changed. There's a story about a young man who committed suicide in his early 20s. That was a very moving story. And that's a story that's timeless, whatever the cost of housing or whatever neighborhoods come or go. Tragedies happen, and they have the same impact.
You now write for the real estate section of the Times. Tell me, what's that like?
It's great. I love it. It's the closest thing to what I was doing, and I feel very fortunate that I'm doing it. I write a column every Sunday called Habitats, and it's basically just about how someone lives somewhere in the 5 boroughs. It has to be legal, I mentioned that. And it can be a house or apartment. I've written about people who live in mansions and housing projects, and in Midtown and farther Staten Island. And people tell me their stories and take me through where they live. And as I tell people when they ask what kind of stories I'm looking for, I say they're all interesting, they're all fascinating. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a great house, and I'm glad people let me come and write about them.
Now, I have to confess that for many years I felt that the Times real estate section did a lot of shilling for the real estate industry, because I mean every story you wrote was about how, you know, if you're going to have any kind of minimal living existence in New York, you've got to pay a fortune for it. Yeah. But you probably don't agree with that.
Well, I don't think I agree. But in terms of in terms of the column, and I think I would even say, but the section is, I don't care, you know, are you a millionaire? Are you on welfare? All I care is, are you living somewhere where I can come and visit you and look around and see what you have. And I tell people it doesn't have to be decor. You know, you don't have to have done interesting things with molding. You don't have to live on Park Avenue. I think everybody, I've interviewed students, I've interviewed people in their 90s, you know, rich, poor, middle, and there's no story that is not fascinating. No story where I don't want to write it forever.
The story behind the habitat.
Story, yeah, the person, and what someone described it as biography through real estate. And you know, what biography isn't interesting?
Is there any place in the city where the rents and purchase prices are still reasonable in the 5 boroughs?
Well,
you mentioned the Grand Concourse.
I mentioned the Grand Concourse, where people buy co-ops in very sturdy, solid buildings with great views and great commutes for far less than they would pay in other parts of the city. So that's an area that I think has to be on the list of places where there's more affordable housing, not tons of them, sadly.
Why bring out a second collection of city section pieces at this time?
Well, I think the first one did very well, NYU Press said, and they had said at the time, you know, if it does well and if there's an appetite for another collection, because you keep having more stories, we'll do another. And I was afraid that the section closing might meant they would change their mind, but they said no, it might be good, because it's not like they still have the section, so there can be the book. And as I remind people in the introduction, everything is online, so if they like this, they can go look at everything else we did on the web.
Are you thinking about writing another book?
I don't know. Maybe.
It's sort of like if it comes.
It's a little bit, yes. Yeah,
How are things at the Times these days?
Well, they're still publishing and still doing amazing stories. And, you know, I mean, although I, you know, cry when I read the political and economic stories, I'm glad that the Times is writing the stories they're writing about serious issues. And it's good people are still doing it, and it's good there's still an appetite for that kind of news. So I guess I'd say good.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're carrying on the city section tradition, even though it's in a different section of the paper, by telling the stories of people and where they live. I want to thank Constance Rosenblum, editor of More New York Stories, the best of the city section of the New York Times. It's just been published by New York University Press. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.